Okay, cultures and cultural platforms. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking about how part of what defines a culture is that it has shared stories. And I recently had the experience of going to a church from the type of church known as Swedenborgian, after a guy whose last name was Swedenborg, who wrote a bunch of stuff about religion and didn't want a church formed after him, one formed anyway. And they've got a quite reflective and quite progressive way of thinking about things. And by progressive, I mean intentionally evolving. I don't mean progressive in any particular flavor that term might mean at a given time. And I found what the minister said during the service quite in line with all of the stuff that I've been talking about and Jordan Hall's been talking about in terms of the meta protocol, which is to say kind of generalizable principles for how human collaboration and trust building and so forth must necessarily work. And so I spoke to the and there was this particular quote that I think was, from one of the books, quoting something that Jesus said, which was basically something like, you need to be nice to everybody. Even the taxpayer's nice to his family, and even the pagans are nice to other pagans, but you need to find a way to be kind to everybody. As a Christian, that's part of what Christianity means. And that points at a way in which, he didn't have the concept of Christianity at the time, but he just had what he was promulgating. And what that points at is something about a way in which what he was trying to point at was compatible in a very serious way with this meta protocol. It wasn't just, here's a way to get along with other people who are doing this way of getting along, but here's a way to approach getting along with everybody. And so I said to the minister something afterwards, that there's a sense in which, there are aspects of Christianity that are pointing at deep truths about reality, deep truths about human nature, deep truths about how trust works and so forth, that are truths that we would want everybody to know and understand. And there are other aspects of Christianity that are very cultural. They're cultural specifics. They're specific stories. You don't need to have all of the Christian stories in order to understand all of these things. Those are just one means to that. You don't need to have all the Christian holidays in order to understand all of these universal truths, necessarily, because if they're true in this universal sense, then they need to be rederivable without any of these things. And so any attempt to say, everybody around the world should have all of these truths in the form we have them, which is to say with our specific stories and our particular practices, that gets into the imperial mode of sort of cultural interplay, I guess you could call it. And so the question of what defines a culture and who gets to say who's part of what. And then there's also a matter of lineage. I happened to be reading last night that there are something like 4 Catholic churches. Now, the word Catholic actually means universal in terms of the Greek etymology. So in saying the Catholic Church, they're saying the church that applies everywhere. And there are 4 of them that all claim to be the one Catholic Church from which the others are offshoots. Now, how would you go about knowing which one was the true Catholic Church? Spoiler alert, there's no way to answer that question. There are ways, but they're all sort of arbitrary. Likewise, China, which is to say mainland large China, says that China, which is to say a tiny island, also known as Taiwan, the mainland thing says that the island is part of us, it's governed by us, it's a province of us. The tiny thing says we're doing our own thing. We are not under you. And in fact, both of them sort of claim to be the legitimate descendant of the Chinese government, such as it was before there were 2. And in some real sense, both of them are. One form of legitimacy is that, the big one is in fact in charge of the big thing, insofar as anyone is. Another form of legitimacy is some sort of sense of continuity with a previous constitution, perhaps, that the small one on the island has. Those are both forms of legitimacy, and so in order to take a stance on any legitimacy, you have to take a stance on the creation of such a legitimacy. And there is no single right answer to that, as far as I can tell. And it is, I think, at this point, a bit absurd for either of them to claim to be legitimately in charge of the other. Like they have schismed at this point, demonstrably. And so this is a very interesting example of a kind of imperial mode, saying that it's in charge of something else. Now they have a lot of shared heritage, they have a shared language and so forth, as do all of these, multitudinous Catholic churches. And some of the Protestant churches still understand themselves to be Catholic in the sense of universal. But they don't use that word because the word has gotten associated with, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, which is involved with the Pope and so forth. And so, where am I going with this? Cultures are defined by stories and by shared references, I guess you could say. And yesterday, actually, I was thinking about what makes something canon. Canon, of course, originally referred to the books that are officially in the Bible. In fact, before that, it just referred to the rules of the church. But then it came to mean the rules of the church for which books are considered legitimate books and which are considered sort of elsewise. And then, of course, authoritative sources such as, there's the Star Wars canon of like which books are officially part of the Star Wars universe and which are kind of essentially fan fiction. And Star Wars famously had, I think they revised it after Disney bought it. Anyway, had at least a large bunch of novels that were considered to be canon, that explored, the past and future and elsewhere of the events of the movies, and the nooks and crannies, and so you don't know in advance what's going to end up being canon. You can sometimes guess, but ultimately, when someone writes a blog post, Scott Alexander's Meditations on Moloch blog post is sort of like assumed reading among lots of people that I hang out with. And various other sources are sort of canon for various groups that I'm part of. And that's part of actually how you know if somebody is part of a group. And this is, I think, why, in part, people get upset when people haven't seen TV shows that they love. There's this sense of, oh, you're not one of us, whoever us is. It's a bit like, someone who goes to a church, meeting someone else and finding out they don't know these particular stories from the Holy Book. And it's like, but the difference is, it's like, everything's become very fragmented. David Chapman talks about atomism as this kind of breakdown of cultures where nobody has all of the same stories in the way that we used to, both in history and in prehistory. Still don't know where I'm going with this, actually. That was a tangent, but it definitely wasn't a destination. I guess maybe what I'm reflecting for myself is as someone who's thinking about the meta protocol and culture crafting, and yes, I started this by saying cultures and cultural platforms. So it's like the new cultural platform that I'm working on emerging, that has been called Game B, or the collaborative culture, or the planetary era, or integral, or various other things, has a different capacity for people to find ways to talk to each other and respect each other, even though they're coming from different cultural backgrounds and stories. There's a kind of recognition that we all need our own stories. They don't need to be shared stories, but they can be we're never going to be able to share all of every culture's stories with every other culture, because that's too many. That would erase the differences in the first place. And microcultures have their own stories. Every family has the classic stories that are told about the funny thing that happened, and the embarrassing thing that happened, and the proud thing that happened, and so forth. And that's to be expected. And those stories all have different different lessons to them. Somebody just ran by with music playing, and I found myself thinking that music is also, of course, very much part of this. And I had the experience at one point of hanging out with a bunch of atheist friends around Christmas, and we wanted to sing, and the only songs that we particularly had to sing together that weren't boring pop songs were hymns, even though largely none of us particularly were finding meaning in the sort of Christian narrative structure at that time. We had these hymns in common, and it was very beautiful to sing them together. And the churches were a source of having meaningful music to sing together, where currently now most of the songs that most of my friends and I have in common are pop songs, which are not that meaningful, and are not intended to be sources of deep shared meaning or sources of aspiration or a sense of wonder or a sense of purpose or a sense of divine connection, So there's this real puzzle here. All of this feels connected, I guess, to the puzzle that John Vervaeke's been talking about a bunch of, creating the new religion that is not a religion, something that allows us to tap transcendence and to get in touch with the divine without taking on that quality of asserting that it knows things that it can't, or that it doesn't, or that other people might disagree with. And let me just rest for a moment, see if there's anything else I want to say. It's a puzzle I've been thinking about a lot recently, and that's part of how I've come to be checking out different churches and trying to get a sense of how they're doing what they're doing. And they all feel familiar in that they bring in all these Christian elements, and some of the Christian elements feel satisfyingly relevant and some feel frustratingly irrelevant. And so it's been a bit of a puzzle trying to figure out, like, can we build something? Is it even possible to build something that simultaneously taps the deep root of familiarity while also changing and evolving? That's I guess really the puzzle here, because even for me, like when I go to a church service, I sometimes feel uncomfortable with phrases that they've changed since I was going as a kid. I'm just like, oh, this isn't, I don't know what we're doing here. This is unfamiliar. This is uncomfortable. And yet that necessarily has to happen in order for change to happen. And I do want my, church services to change. Now, partially this could be, I'm not in favor of a particular change, but yeah, the question of what could form I think if I were designing a church service, I'd want to really include some elements that are deeply, deeply timeless. Like, that, perhaps the whole thing begins with everybody just singing no words together in some open-ended way that maybe has part of it that's the same and part of it that's improvised, but the point is, like, it has no words, and so it could translate across languages, or not even. It'll never end up feeling outdated in its language, and that could be an element that could persist 1,000 years or even 100 at this current pace of cultural change without coming to feel antiquated. That feels exciting to me. And then, it's like to sort of have a bridge of elements that change at different paces. So you have an element like that is truly intended to be part of anything that follows this lineage would be intended to have that forever in some form that would be recognizable. And then at the same time, you have other elements that are sort of like, you could actually design elements of the service. It's like, yes, this part of the service or whatever, the ceremony, the ritual is supposed to change every 1,000 years. This part's supposed to change every 300 years. This part's supposed to change every 100 years. This part changes every 30. This part changes every 10. I'm sort of doing a kind of logarithmic thing here or whatever. This part changes every 3 years. This part changes every year. This other part changes, every few months. And this part of the surface is constantly on a new edge. Like it is intended to be, some persons, whether it's someone in a sort of minister or priest type role, or someone in a more whatever kind of role, that they would be speaking to something at the edge of their own thinking and understanding in that moment, and to kind of have all of those different paces of evolution happening at the same time. And of course, even the structure that I'm describing probably also should evolve, because whether or not, even if I've come up with a pretty good guess of what should change at what rate, there might nonetheless be ways in which that is confused, and then what is the rate at which that should evolve? So those, I guess, are some open questions that I have in the space of conscious cultural evolution, which is the world that we are now stepping into in this era, I guess. Culture has been evolving the whole time, but we're starting to be stewards of that process in a way that we weren't before. Yeah. Be well.